Picture a 10-year-old boy. He's standing in a parking lot in New Jersey. It's a Tuesday afternoon. School is out. His father is nearby, and that's a good thing, because his father is his hero. His father is big and loud and magnetic, the kind of man other men go quiet around. And this boy, he wants to be exactly that. Then his father takes a butcher's cleaver and cuts off a man's finger. And the boy watches, and he doesn't run, he doesn't cry. He just watches. That boy is Tony Soprano. And what happened next, not in that parking lot, but in the decades that followed, is one of the most uncomfortable psychological case studies ever put on television. Here's the question I want to sit with today. Was Tony Soprano born evil? Or was he built that way, piece by piece, year by every person who was supposed to love him? Because the easy answer is that Tony Soprano is a monster. He murders people. He cheats on his wife. He manipulates everyone around him. He is, by any reasonable moral standard, a bad man. But the easy answer is almost never the whole story. And the more you actually look at Tony's life, not from a distance but up close, the more uncomfortable a different question becomes. Did Tony Soprano ever have a real chance? Let's start at the source, because everything about Tony Soprano eventually leads back to one woman. Livia Soprano is one of the most psychologically terrifying characters in television history, and she never once pulls a trigger. She doesn't need to. Livia operates through something far more insidious than violence. She operates through emotional withdrawal, through martyrdom, through this constant suffocating message that the world is dark and cruel and nobody truly loves you, except her. There's a scene early in the series where Tony tells Dr. Melfi his mother threatened to put a fork in his eye when he was a child. He says it almost like a punchline. He laughs. Melfi doesn't laugh. And that's the thing about emotional abuse. It disguises itself as normal. It teaches you that this is what love looks like. It rewires you so completely that by the time you're an adult, you don't even have the language to describe what was done to you. Because you were never given that language. Tony was never held. He was controlled. He was never affirmed. He was needed. Livia didn't raise a son. She created a mirror for her own suffering and spent 40 years making sure it reflected exactly what she wanted to see. There is a clinical term for this: covert emotional abuse. It leaves no bruises. It leaves something worse. It leaves you grateful for it. And then there's the father, Johnny Boy Soprano. Charming, violent, utterly intoxicating to a young boy who just wants to feel proud of someone. Tony idolized his father. You can see it in the flashback sequences. Young Tony watching Johnny hold court, watching other men defer to him, watching him move through the world like gravity didn't quite apply to him. This was Tony's first lesson in masculinity. Power equals respect. Silence equals strength. Emotion equals weakness. The cleaver scene. Satriel's pork store. Johnny doesn't explain himself to his son afterward. He doesn't comfort him or check whether he's okay. He probably assumes his boy is fine, because that's what you do. You're fine. You move on. You don't talk about it. Tony doesn't talk about it for 30 years. Instead, he starts having panic attacks. This is where the show becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because Tony Soprano, this 300-pound mob boss who has people killed for disrespecting him, faints when he sees a family of ducks fly away from his pool. Ducks. Baby ducks. And that moment isn't played for laughs, it's played as tragedy. Because what Dr. Melfi eventually helps Tony understand is that the ducks represented the one thing Tony has never been able to hold on to: a family that stays. His body knew what his mind refused to process. The panic attacks were his nervous system finally sending a bill for 50 years of unpaid emotional debt. But here's the cruel irony. The same culture that broke Tony Soprano is the reason he could never be fixed by therapy. In the mob, you don't see a shrink. You don't talk about your feelings, you don't have feelings, or if you do, you bury them under rage and food and women and work. Tony going to Dr. Melfi is treated like a character flaw by the men around him. Something shameful, something weak. So he goes. And he lies. And he half-tries. And every time he gets close to something real, every time Melfi cracks something open, Tony retreats back behind the wall. Not because he doesn't want to change, but because he genuinely doesn't know how. Here's the psychological framework that makes all of this land so hard. Generational trauma isn't a metaphor. It's a mechanism. The way a parent regulates, or fails to regulate, their own emotions becomes the template their child uses. Livia never processed her own fear and depression. She offloaded it onto Tony. Johnny never processed his violence and shame. He modeled it for Tony. And Tony, with no other blueprint, absorbed all of it. He becomes Livia when he manipulates Christopher. He becomes Johnny Boy when he beats someone half to death in a diner parking lot. He even knows this. There are moments in therapy, genuinely stunning moments, where Tony demonstrates real psychological insight. He can see the patterns, he can name them, and then he goes home and repeats them anyway. That gap between understanding and change is one of the most honest things the show ever does. Because insight without safety, without support, without a completely different environment isn't enough. Tony is trying to do surgery on himself while still living inside the wound. At one point, his son AJ starts having panic attacks. The cycle didn't stop. The most heartbreaking moments in The Sopranos aren't the murders. They're the almosts. Tony almost opens up completely to Melfi. Almost. He pulls back. Tony almost has a genuine connection with his son. Almost. He makes it about himself. Tony almost chooses a different life. There's a whole season built around what happens when he's near death, when he gets a glimpse of another existence, a quieter self. And he comes back from that experience and still can't change. Because change would require dismantling the only identity he's ever had, the only version of himself he knows how to be. Take away the mob, take away the violence, take away the control, and what's left? Tony Soprano has no idea, and that terrifies him more than any enemy ever could. So, how much of it was actually his fault? Well, all of it, and none of it. And that's not a dodge, that's the truth. Tony Soprano chose to kill people. He chose betrayal. He chose cruelty when kindness was available to him. Every morning he woke up and made 1,000 small decisions that added up to the life he lived. Responsibility doesn't disappear because your childhood was hard. But Tony Soprano was also handed a loaded gun at 10 years old and told it was a gift. He was raised by a woman who taught him that love and suffering were the same thing. He was trained by a culture that punished vulnerability with death, sometimes literally. He reached out for help, imperfectly and inconsistently, and got just enough to understand his damage, but never enough to actually heal it. He was a man who could quote Exodus, feel genuine tenderness for animals, love his children with something real, and still be capable of absolute brutality. That contradiction isn't hypocrisy. It's what trauma actually looks like in a human being. The tragedy of Tony Soprano isn't that he was a monster. The tragedy is that somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the ego and the violence and the decades of armor, there was a 10-year-old boy in a parking lot who just wanted his father to be proud of him. And that boy never got out. If this essay made you feel uncomfortable, good, that's the point. Because the most dangerous thing about Tony Soprano isn't the violence, it's the recognition. It's the moment you catch yourself understanding him, maybe even sympathizing with him. Tony Soprano didn't come from nowhere. He came from a family, a neighborhood, a culture, a silence. The same forces that shaped him shape real people every single day. So maybe the scariest thing about Tony Soprano is how human he really is. If you want more essays like this on the psychology of complex characters, subscribe. New video every week. See you next time.